In today's video, I want to take a look at some NHL offseason rumors and things that we might see happen this summer, including could the Montreal Canadiens possibly look at trading forward Jonathan Drouin, and could longtime goaltender, member of the Florida Panthers, Roberto Luongo, consider retirement? We'll get into all the latest coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams, so if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. So as I mentioned today, I want to take a look at some NHL rumors that have been going around and things we might see during the offseason. And I want to get started with Montreal Canadiens forward Jonathan Drouin. Now, of course, Marc Bergevin made a big trade to acquire this player from the Tampa Bay Lightning just a couple seasons ago, giving up prized defensive prospect Mikhail Sergachev. Now, many people were critical of this trade. I know I was a little skeptical myself if this was the right move for the Montreal Canadiens. Not taking anything away from Drouin's game, but it was believed that when he was traded for, that he was going to be like their top line center. And I wasn't really confident that Drouin would work out to be a top line center at the NHL level. Now, he's a very gifted offensive player. There's no doubt about that. But at times, there certainly has been some question marks around other parts of his game and whether or not he can be a top line type of player consistently, at least at the NHL level. Now, of course, Mikhail Sergachev was drafted with a lot of pedigree and certainly had a potential to be a very top pairing offensively gifted defenseman. Of course, he hasn't quite had that opportunity to play that type of role with Tampa Bay. Obviously, they have a very stacked team, very deep on the defense as well. Guys like Victor Hedman getting a lot of the, the scoring chances and a lot of the ice time ahead of him. But Sergachev has certainly worked his way up into that lineup and slowly building up to a more prominent role. And I do think here over the next year or two, as Tampa Bay has, like many other teams, many tough salary cap implicated things to look at, Sergachev is certainly going to work his way up that ladder as he's got still a cheaper contract here. He's going to work himself into a consistent top four role and eventually be that player that we thought he was going to be. Now, on Drouin's side of the game here, obviously with Montreal, last year wasn't exactly, a home run success in his debut season with the Montreal Canadiens. And this season, though, things got off to a much better start. He was playing with Max Domi, who was acquired in the summer, and another trade made by GM Marc Bergevin that certainly had some people questioning that as well. Obviously, that trade for Alex Galchenyuk straight up for Max Domi was certainly question marked. I know I was one that was critical of it as well at the time, but I must say so far that deal has worked out quite nicely for the Montreal Canadiens. Max Domi's been a great addition there, certainly thriving in that strong hockey market. Early on, at least for the early chunk of the season, he was thriving in part due to his play with Jonathan Drouin. If you look at their more recent stats, Domi's kind of continued producing at a better rate than Drouin. Obviously, at one point, their point totals were pretty much comparable. Now, Domi is a fair bit ahead of Drouin on the offensive output. Not only has we seen Jonathan Drouin's offensive output decrease as of late, but his ice time has certainly gone down a lot as well, and you can certainly sense a frustration with head coach Claude Julien and his ability to really put him out there a lot in key situations when they really need, some key offensive moments or other parts of the game where he can't rely on them to get the job done as well. We've seen a lot of times where his ice time has been down significantly. If you take a look at the graphic on the screen, you'll take a look at his ice time here in the last number of games. Like I said, for the Florida Panthers, he played just shy of 17 minutes last night against the Panthers in a big victory for the Montreal Canadiens. Of course, before that, the Carolina Hurricanes game, he only played 9:57. Versus the Buffalo Sabres, he only played 12:13. Against the Islanders before that, he played 12:15. The game before that against the Flyers, he only played 10:55. Then, of course, the other game against Chicago, prior to that, he was up a bit at 15:13. Then, of course, he was down again before that against the Islanders at 13:35. So obviously, more often than not, lately, Jonathan Drouin is just not getting the job done for the Montreal Canadiens. His ice time is down. You do sense the frustration with the head coach, and you can't help but wonder if they might have to consider making a different trade here during the offseason. Now, obviously, they've had Domi playing a lot of center ice. They've drafted Jesperi Kotkaniemi, obviously, as well. They got Philip Deneau. Now, as much as all those guys have had pretty decent years, and they've all kind of solidified that center ice position for Montreal, certainly better than they had been in years past, they still don't have that guy who, in my opinion, who's at least that true number one center iceman. As much as Max Domi's had a breakthrough season, if he was able to play with a top center iceman, it might be better off to put him on the wing. Or if he was the number 2 center, certainly might give enough insulation that their top 6 would be that much more solid, and therefore, propel them into being a much more offensively gifted team. They still do rely a lot on Carey Price, And obviously Price's performance this year has certainly been a big part as well in their resurgence to get into a playoff position here as they fight for the wildcard spot heading down the stretch. So obviously Drouin still has 4 years left after this year on that contract of $5.5 million. His numbers have been decent this year, but like I said, down the stretch in the last number of games, he's just not getting it done when it matters most. And if they do get into the playoffs, his performance is going to be key to determine, I think, his future with Montreal. Now, I'm not saying for sure that they should or they're going to trade him, but you just can't help but wonder with a lot of the talk around the league and the sense of frustration with his head coach, with this player, that maybe that's something that they take a look at this summer. Now, it might be very, very difficult, though, for them to get back to the type of return that they gave up for Drouin, giving up Sergachev. It's unlikely at this point, I would think, that they'd get back that type of player in return. At the same time, though, they might go a different route and maybe look for a young, high-scoring forward, but that also might be difficult to do. So they very well might not make a move, even if they're considering it, based on the fact that the return that they would be looking for just might not be there. But if you take a look at Marc Bergevin's trade record, even though he had a lot of criticism coming into the season this year and even into last offseason, his last few trades, in between here, especially the Max Domi trade, has worked out. So maybe he could pull off another deal and swap Drouin for another player who comes in and really rejuvenates that offense. Hard to say, but I'd like to know your thoughts down below. There's a lot of talk right now about Jonathan Drouin in Montreal and if there's really a long-term fit there and if he could be moved. So I know there's lots of Habs fans that watch this channel, so I'd love your feedback. Do you think the Montreal Canadiens do consider trading Jonathan Drouin this summer? And if they do, what type of return do you think is reasonable and what should they really be looking for if they decide to go down that road? Now, the other big thing I want to take a look at here is Florida Panther goaltender Roberto Luongo. Now, as we know, Luongo is getting older. He's been, kind of a little bit injury prone the last couple of years, but he's certainly had a tremendous NHL career, playing mostly with the Florida Panthers. And of course, he had a long stretch of time with the Vancouver Canucks that was very successful as well, taking into the Stanley Cup final against the Bruins back in 2011, only to come up a little bit short there in that elusive Stanley Cup. So as good of a career Luongo has had, obviously that Stanley Cup seems to be escaping him, and obviously staying with the Panthers is likely not going to accomplish that. But there's been some talk that he very well might wrap things up at the end of this season and call it a career and head into retirement. As we know, the Florida Panthers have been highly speculated to make a lot of changes this summer, coming right down from ownership from Vinny Viola through the general manager's office. In that roster, they already made some trades at the deadline, trading guys like McCann and Bukestad. Obviously they moved up Broussard as well after picking him up. So there's some talk as well. They asked guys like Mike Hoffman about, his no trade clause and getting a list of teams that he'd accept a trade to, because that's only a modified no trade. So there's been a lot of talk. They're going to make other moves this summer to kind of free up some cap space to go after guys like Panarin and Bobrovsky. And obviously, if they were to bring in Sergei Bobrovsky, it probably wouldn't make much sense to still have a guy like Roberto Luongo on the roster. But at the same time, he has indicated that if he were to stay in Florida and they were to bring in another starting goaltender, that he would have no problem taking more of a backup consistent role. He's acknowledged the fact, a 50 to 60 game schedule really isn't something he can handle anymore. And he's, more than willing to accept a reduced role with the Florida Panthers. We know that he's made South Florida his home. He's likely going to live there for a long time. He and his family have been there for a long stretch of time. So he's not going anywhere from his home life. And there's also the other possibility is that could he possibly end up on long-term injury reserve next year? As we know, his body's certainly been banged up and gone through a lot over the years. So is it a possibility here that, maybe they might find some injuries or he might not be able to go next year, and that could end up on LTIR? Now, of course, if Roberto Luongo does consider officially retiring, not only is that important for the Florida Panthers in the fact that he'd still have a bit of a cap hit while he'd be in retirement, but at the same time, it also affects the Vancouver Canucks. Obviously, Luongo was given one of those mega long-term deals that were kind of outlawed in the latest CBA. That contract was kind of crazy. It was really front-loaded. The actual salary he's going to be earning over the next 3 years, if he remains and doesn't retire, would only be, just a little over $1 million, but the cap hit is much higher. The Vancouver Canucks would then suddenly be on the hook for a $2.8 million cap hit should Luongo call it a career and retire before the contract is up. And that's something that they were aware before they ever traded him to the Florida Panthers as well. So obviously that kind of has some cap implications. And of course, with the Canucks being where they are and with everything, that may not actually hurt them too much. But still, at the end of the day, that is going to impact the overall cap situation if Luongo retires, which then throws another curveball, is if he is going to retire and if he doesn't feel his body can, pass all the tests in the beginning of the season and actually play next year, could they consider maybe working on a deal to send him back to the Canucks to be on their roster, and then he could be on their long-term injury reserve, which then at least instead of having that $2.8 million cap hit due to retirement, at least they have means to get the cap relief through the LTIR system instead. Now, of course, with the Florida Panthers, they also have James Reimer under contract for a few more years, and obviously his season hasn't been great. We've saw youngster Samuel Montembeault come up recently, and for the most part, he's played relatively well. The last few starts haven't been as good, but I want to get a long look at him here as well. So with all those guys in the mix and the potential for Sergei Bobrovsky to come in, what would the Florida Panthers do next year? So could we see Bobby Lou retire this summer? And obviously with all the cap implications of both the Panthers and the Canucks, could he even possibly end up being traded first beforehand as well? So it should be some interesting times here to see what Luongo decides and how the Florida Panthers handle their goaltending situation heading into the offseason to prepare for next year and all the rumors surrounding them and what they're planning to do to make this team better. Of course, as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this as well down in the comment section. Let me know what you think, and we will continue the conversation. If you're new to the channel here, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams, and there's plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up before you go. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you very much for watching, everybody. We will catch you next time.